Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Herr, Jesu Christ, wahr, Mensch und Gott, which translates to Lord Jesus Christ, true man and God. Very interesting chorale. Lots of unusual chord progressions in this one, and a very active, or harmonically active phrase going on in between the second and third phrase. Kind of saw a parallel between the two chorales that we have looked at, well, that I've looked at today. Like I mentioned in the previous video, I didn't upload the day before, just busy with work, so today is a double upload. This is the second video in that double upload. Lots of harmonic activity. Let's hop right into the analysis. So we have three sharps in the key signature. We start off with A, we end with A. So I think this is a case where the key signature accurately reflects the overall tonality of the chorale, and that is A major. And the phrase that we have here, I think there might be some room for debate. I think it's an imperfect authentic cadence, but there might be room to argue that it's a half cadence as well, because this G sharp really does feel like it wants to resolve back up to A, and that really is sort of a hallmark of the half cadence, the fact that the melody still has a tendency to want to resolve. But with the D sharps occupying really about half of the phrase's entire length, I feel like we've modulated to the key of E using a really unconventional progression. So we start off with A, passing tones in the lower voices, then we have C sharp, E, the same E and the same A, which is just taking our chord and putting it in first inversion. Passing tones in the lower voices again before we get A major, A, E, C sharp, and that same A again, which is just taking our same A major and putting it in root position again. We have another passing tone here in the alto before we get D, D, A, and F sharp, which is D major in root position, which is our 4 chord. And here's a really interesting progression. We have D major with the passing 7th on the bass. That takes us to B major, B, D sharp, F sharp, and B, which is really interesting because of where it resolves. But this is 5 of 5. B major is the dominant of E, and E is our 5. And if we look at the way the D sharp resolves, it resolves the way that we would expect it to. But if you look at the other voices, well, we actually get this G sharp here that gets prepared as the chord tone in the next chord as well. But if we look at the chord that's a result, we have C sharp, E, G sharp, and A, which is kind of an interesting chord. I think there's some stuff to unpack here. I'm going to say that this is an A major 7 chord in first inversion. So that would be, because we haven't modulated yet, that's going to be 1. This is what's really interesting about it, because it doesn't really make sense. It's sort of like happening over a secondary dominant. Like maybe the modulation is actually happening over a secondary dominant, if that's the case. But maybe with this G here being like that would be like a 5/4 suspension over the bass. So yeah, I'm going to say that perhaps this is a tonic 7, a tonic 7th chord in first inversion, so like 1-6-5, but in the key of E major, possibly it's 4-6-5. I think if the argument was being made that we're in the key of E major, it happened here or here, and it's a bit of a zone. And the toss-up is modulating over a secondary dominant, which is something that I tend to avoid in my analysis. It's something that I did with some regularity in my earlier videos. If you go back and watch some of the videos, like really at the beginning of the channel, you'll see that there are some points where I analyzed modulations over a secondary dominant, and really I don't think there's anything too wrong with it. It's just, if the secondary dominant is the common chord to the next key, I really feel like there needs to be more of a compelling argument for that. And for me, I feel like with this G sharp sort of operating as a suspension, this very easily could be an F sharp minor chord in second inversion, like F sharp minor 7 over C sharp, or this G could be part of just a greater, just A major idea. Really, this being a tonic 7th chord is more so a byproduct of this G here being held over and being the majority of what we hear over the span of the beat. But what makes it so that we can't modulate before that is the fact that we come from D major. That would be some very interesting mode mixture, saying that this is like a subtonic seventh taking us to 5 in the key of E major. That'd be some unprecedented level of chord borrowing on Bach's behalf. I think it's a little too hip for him to use. Not to say that he wasn't capable of doing it, it just wasn't stylistic of his writing, and if that were the case, it would be a very much an anomaly in his writing. So I think this is like the tonic triad that's being repurposed as our subdominant as we're getting ready for our cadence, and it just so happens to have that seventh being suspended here in the alto. So whether this is a tonic 7 chord or just a tonic chord in general, I don't know. You could spell the entire tonic triad without this voice, so really tonic 7th chords are relatively uncommon, but because of the unique profile of this this phrase up until this point, sort of leaves us with a couple of awkward options to analyze a modulation over. It's either a tonic 7th chord, right, a tonic 7th chord with air quotes, or a secondary dominant. And I think that, you know, with the A major happening after the B major chord, there's really nothing inherently E major happening after that, right? So it kind of just shuts down what's supposed to happen. It's sort of it happens, and then that's shut down, and then the idea of E major is reinforced with the D sharp again. So we have D sharp, B, F sharp, and A, which is 5, 6, 5, B7 over D sharp, and then we cadence on E major, E, B, E, and G sharp. And of course you could hear this as a half cadence. The first time I listened to it, it was a half cadence, but this progression right here of D major to B major, that chromatic mediant, really threw me off. I didn't know exactly what to make of it. It really is just more so a byproduct of this chromatic line, I feel, here in the tenor, and it has a really big impact on the overall sound. Moving forward, we have another authentic cadence in the key of E major by the way that I look at it, but I do think the phrase starts off in the key of A major. Like, really, this is just a glorified half cadence, even though I do feel like Bach has modulated to the key of E major at some point in this phrase. So I think this E major chord is our 5. It does go to A, E, and C sharp. So root position tonic triad, and then we start to see kind of a vibe from the previous phrase where we start off with just sort of keeping the A major idea alive. Not as long, but keep it alive for at least 2 beats. We have another tonic triad here, so we don't need to reanalyze. Passing 7th in the bass, and then we get F sharp minor, F sharp, A, and C, which is our 6th chord. And if we move back to the key of E major here, this becomes our 2 chord in root position. And the reason why I think the modulation's happening here is fairly straightforward. It's because we have D sharp on the next beat, and it feels like a logical place to analyze a modulation if the chord before it is a common chord. And F sharp minor is a common chord between A major and E major. It turns from the submediant to the supertonic. Unlike here where we see a D sharp, and modulating beforehand would be kind of interesting. I don't really hear anything E major like happening at this point. It's kind of like a mismatch, or like an A Lydian idea. Maybe it's an A Lydian idea that sort of gets repurposed as E major. Who knows? But yeah, that's the difference between seeing this D sharp and marking the modulation before, and seeing this D sharp and marking the modulation before. There's just different contexts happening, and it just doesn't quite make sense here. At least in my brain, it doesn't make sense for Bach to have done that based on my experience with him. But this F sharp is our chord tone, E is a passing 7th, and then we have D sharp, B, A, and F sharp, which is B7 over D sharp, another 5-6-5 chord. We've seen this chord before, and that takes us to E major, E, B, G sharp, and E. Tonic triad. Passing tone in the bass before we get G sharp, B, G sharp, and E, which is just taking our chord, putting it in first inversion. We've seen this before. Another passing tone in the bass, B, B, F sharp, and D sharp. It's our 5 chord, B major, little chordal 7th there. And then we have E, B, A, and E. This A is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. We see this when Bach cadences on some tonic triads from time to time, where he'll have this little 8th note embellishment where it turns from a 4-3 turns from a 4 into a 3, this suspension over the cadence. Okay, third phrase. By far the most interesting. Well, actually, by far, that's kind of a strong statement. I'd say maybe this D major to B major might be the hallmark of this particular chorale in terms of the sound. But yeah, definitely some equally, if not a little bit more interesting things happening here in the third phrase. We start off with E sharp, C sharp, G, and C sharp. So like a multi-phrase chromatic bass line here. We have, this is C sharp major over E sharp, which is 5/6 of 2. The analysis for this phrase, I think there's a big picture here where Bach is tonicizing a series of chords, and he sort of chains the idea of E major to coincidentally B minor again, which is fascinating because Bach, if you watch the previous video, episode 328, or it's 328, you'll see that Bach shows a relationship between E major and B minor as well. But there's not a super elegant way to do that. I mean, E major and B minor could potentially have chords in common between them, but you'd have to make some chromatic alterations in order to achieve it. Like in yesterday's chorale, when Bach modulated between E major and B minor, E major was the common chord, but of course E major is a byproduct of melodic minor, so there's a chromatic alteration being made to the B minor scale. So here, especially hearing the phrase open up with F sharp minor, you could call this a direct modulation to F sharp minor. Personally, for me, it doesn't make too much of a difference because we've tonicized chords in the key beforehand, and this very easily could just turn back around into a 2-5-1 in the key of E major. But in the grand scheme of things, I do think he's going to end up in F sharp minor anyways, so maybe it makes sense for this to be a direct modulation. Yeah, actually, I'm going to walk that back and say that this is a direct modulation, and this is in the key of F sharp minor, and this is in fact just a 5/6 chord. You could analyze this as a common chord progression or a common chord modulation, where this F sharp is a common chord between F sharp minor and E major, but the fact that it's happening at the beginning of the phrase and this E sharp versus the E natural, they feel like separate ideas. Especially when they're in the same voice. Really, that goes to show that if it were happening in the same phrase, like here, for example, with the D and the D sharp, where we're seeing a tonicization here, when it's the first thing you hear in a new phrase, unless there's a compelling enough reason to keep it in the same key, no real reason to do so. So this feels like a direct modulation to me now that I've talked myself out of it, and then I'm trying to audiate it in my head while I'm talking, and it just feels like the E sharp being the starting point of the new phrase does set that precedent of F sharp. So it does modulate where we would expect to F sharp minor, F sharp A, F sharp and C, which is our tonic triad, neighboring tone in the tenor before we get G, A sharp, E, and C sharp, which is A sharp fully diminished 7th over G. And I'm going to analyze this as a secondary dominant, kind of the same way that we analyzed a secondary dominant here, as 7/4-2 of 4. And we would expect this to resolve to some type of 7/6 chord. The bass resolves down by step, but the root does not resolve the way that we would expect. The A sharp goes upwards, but the chordal 7th does resolve down by step. So one of the voices, maybe the most predictable voice, does move in the direction that we would expect, but the rest of the voices move elsewhere because we're seeing this as a 4/2 chord, and we would expect 7 of 4 to resolve to 4. I think there's some compromise happening here where the 4/2 chord's bass resolves the way we would expect, but the root position or the root movement isn't what we would expect, because we would expect a 7/4-2 chord to resolve to 3, some type of 3/6 chord, but instead of seeing 3/6, we see 4/6-4. Or we would expect this to resolve to some type of 3/6 chord in terms of B minor, which would be a 6 chord in the key of F sharp minor. But this 4/6-4 chord is just a passing 6/4. As you can see, the bass is in this passing tone configuration, it's just going to end up being our tonic triad in the key of B minor. Super fascinating progression. The fact that a 4-2 chord doesn't resolve the way that we would expect traditionally, but we can justify it using logic and context is really exciting, because it's not just one of those cases where it's just nebulous and there's no reasoning behind why it breaks the convention. In this case, there is a reason why, and we're just seeing 1-6-4 sort of operate as a logical substitute. But after 1-6-4, we move to E, B, G, and C sharp. I think this B is like a kind of like a 5-4 suspension over the bass. I really feel like this A sharp here. Yeah, I do think that this B is operating kind of like a suspension that doesn't really make a ton of sense from a theoretical standpoint, right? Because we're expecting to analyze suspensions with a dissonance going to a consonance, not the other way around, or two consonances. Here, the A sharp would be a 4th over the E. And this is some type of 7 chord. It would be over E, A sharp, fully diminished 7th, so that'd be a 7-4-3 chord. And when we see 1 in an inversion going to a 7 chord in an inversion, we would expect to see 1 in an inversion on the other side. And we do. We have D, B, F sharp, and B, which is 1-6. So typically what we see is 1-6-7-6-1, but here we see 1-6-4-7-4-3, or I guess this could be 7-6-4 as well, hypothetically speaking, going to 1-6. So that's a variation on a very common pattern that we see in Bach. And as we're closing in on our perfect authentic cadence in the key of B minor, super cool that we're seeing E major to B minor again. That's pretty neat. We have some non-chord tones here, E, E, and G. This spells an E minor chord, which is 4 in root position. And then we have F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A sharp, which is our 5 chord, F sharp major in root position. And then the 7th of the chord turns into a suspension, just like the previous phrase. B, B, E being a 4-3 suspension over the bass, D and B, 3 roots and 1/3 spelling, but still a tonic triad nonetheless. And in the next phrase, we're going to take the chorale out in the key of the overall tonic, which is A major. But I do think we get a mid-phrase modulation here, because when we see melodic minor in the bass, also with this, G sharp is diatonic to A major, but when we see melodic minor in a section that is otherwise not in that same key, I feel like that just takes the extra step beyond tonicizing. That's just me. But we'll get to it when we get to it. I do think that also another interesting tidbit, this E major chord, or sorry, B minor chord is 2 in the key of A, and it ends up progressing to 1. A, E, A, and C sharp, tonic triad, root position. A potentially straightforward 2-to-1 progression here. I'd say if you've watched my videos in the past, that will make sense to you. The fact that 2 going to 1 is always an elusive chord progression. We very seldom see it in plain sight. It's either part of a subdivided chord progression, or it's buried somewhere in the texture and there's just a more logical chord that can be pulled out of the texture. It's very seldom that we see a 2 chord go to a 1 chord with literal barrier or strings attached. And here, I'd say that really the only grain of salt that you should take this progression with is the fact that we're starting a new phrase. Like, yes, this B minor kind of does sound like it's progressing to A as a 2 chord going to 1, a very stable progression, but it is a new phrase, and A is sort of the really the launch pad that the rest of the phrase is going to take off from. So this B minor to A wouldn't be the same as if we started the phrase with B minor and then we went to A major. The fact that this is a new idea sort of just feels like 2 complete phrases, or 2 complete ideas grammatically going from one to the next. So yeah, grain of salt. So after our tonic triad, we get another tonic triad, A, E, same E as well, and same C sharp, so no need to reanalyze. Passing tone in the bass, and then we get a similar progression that we had here, F sharp, same A and same C sharp. That's F sharp minor, which is our 6th chord. And I think this is actually where we get a brief modulation to F sharp minor. You don't have to analyze it this way. You could analyze this as a progression still in the key of A and we're just tonicizing F sharp minor. But to me, it sounds like this is going a step beyond tonicizing and we are getting a brief departure from A. The keys are relative to one another, so it's not like the craziest thing. It's not like if you would have gone to like E minor, for example, he's going to F sharp minor, and that's, you know, something that Bach does from time to time. Passing 7th in the bass, D sharp, F sharp, same F sharp, same A, and then we have B here, which is B7 over D sharp. That is melodic minor, not a secondary dominant, so that's a 4-6-5 chord. And then we have a passing tone in the bass here, anticipation here in the tenor, and kind of a suspension being set up here in the alto. With that B, we have C sharp 7 over E, which is 5-6-5, very common subdivided chord progression that we see in melodic minor. We would expect that to go to 1 F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, and A, this G sharp being a 9/8 suspension over the bass, 9/8 suspensions being very common over tonic triads, and I do think this is taking us right back to the key of A major. Our tonic triad is now our 6th chord. We went in with the same chord, and we went out with the same chord. And we're getting ready for our cadence here. So following our 6th chord, we would typically expect 2, but we don't get 2. We actually get 1-6, C sharp, same C sharp, E, and the same A, 1-6. And we have some non-chord tones here, passing tone, anticipation, and very similar to the previous beat, we have a suspension being set up, so actually all the voices are doing the same thing on the offbeat, but we're seeing something very similar to what happened in the previous phrase where we're setting up with a 1-6 chord and going to a passing 4 chord, D major, this is a B, so D, B, F sharp, and A, which is 2-6-5, B minor 7 over D, and that takes us to E. That makes more sense. I had that written down as a 4 in my notes, but that's just because I misread the tenor here. E, B, F sharp, and G sharp. Very interesting to see a 9/8 suspension over a dominant chord, but here we are seeing it. We've also seen E as our tonic in 2 of the phrases, so maybe that is a nod to the fact that E has been our tonic previously in this chorale. Who knows? But C sharp is a non-chord tone. D is like a neighboring 7th, and then we cadence on A major, apologies. A, C sharp, E, and A. Tonic triad root position. That is today's analysis, or I guess the second analysis from today, because today is a rare double upload. But that being said, this chorale, I don't want to say it's fairly straightforward. I'd say that it's maybe moderately straightforward. All the harmony was more or less functional. I'd say the biggest points of contention are here. We definitely get a modulation, or do we definitely get a modulation to the key of E major? I mean, even after listening to this 4 or 5 times, this did sound like a cadence in like the key of A major to me. It almost sounded like a half cadence, but I feel like with the D sharps being so prevalent throughout the phrase, maybe I tricked myself into thinking that this sounded like E major. I don't know. There are definitely multiple outlooks that you could take on this particular phrase, but I think what's really throwing me off here is the fact that we have D major to B major, and we would expect D major to this B major chord to be an intermediary chord to E major, but the fact that this is an A major chord is definitely indicative of the fact that it is a secondary dominant, or sorry, a secondary deceptive progression, but it turns into a tonic 7th chord, which is, you know, as Bach gets into cadence territory, that's when we get the most contrapuntal. I think all in all, the fact that this is a tonic 7th chord is not the big picture. It's potentially an interesting talking point, but it's not, I think, it's definitely taken with a grain of salt, because the 7th really sort of looks like this G is almost like a suspension that's pointing towards this F sharp here, that then goes down to E. So all in all, very unusual progression, chromatic mediant progression here, which is pretty neat. The fact that there are mid-phrase modulations, right? We start in A and we go to E. We start in F sharp and go to B minor. we start in A and go to F sharp and then go back to A. We've seen a couple of mid-phrase modulations in this particular chorale. Also the potential of a 2-1 progression. It's not a very common progression that we see in Bach. We tend to see the tonic approached using the leading tone, and if we do see a plagal progression, it's typically 4 going to 1, not 2 going to 1. It's not a bass movement that we're used to seeing where the rest of the chords supporting it is just 2 root position adjacent chords going down. Typically when we see adjacent harmony, it's going up, right? Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We do see that from time to time in Bach, but we are not, but here we're seeing Bach go against the pattern that we've otherwise observed in his music. And what else? I think that's pretty much it. I think also, whether or not this modulation to F sharp minor actually happens, and if we just stay in E the entire time and then we move to B minor, that would definitely draw a comparison between yesterday's chorale, or not really yesterday's chorale, but the chorale I uploaded earlier today, and the chorale that I just finished analyzing. The fact that there's a pretty much direct relationship between moving from E major to B minor, that's pretty interesting. But Bach does so via F sharp minor, or at least tonicizing F sharp minor here. Other than that, I think really the only other takeaway is this interesting variation on the 1-7-1 progression that we see a ton in Bach, and that is 1 in second inversion to 7 in second inversion to 1 in first inversion. It's a variation on a pattern that we see all the time in Bach, and I think that this is a cool adaptation of that pattern. But that's pretty much all I have to say about today's chorale. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video, and thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.